or inefficiency of creating thousands of images or thousands of viewpoints. How does a human being then assess and judge whether those are better or worse than what could have been done with their own, with other tools, right? So it kind of brings me to this idea of like, we have the capabilities now of making 1,000 versions of the same painting. How do we figure out now? The next thing is figuring out what is the best. Well, what does that mean? To whom? And maybe it isn't about one best. Maybe it's about multiple bests because everybody perceives differently. But it's just going to open up a whole bunch of other thoughts and ideas that we were thinking in a very one-to-one way, and now we can think in a one-to-many way.
Welcome, everyone, to the first annual Synthetic Media Year in Review edition of the Voicebot Podcast. And we're doing this jointly with Synthedia. Some of you know there are two different things that we do over here. I'm Bret Kinsella. I'm founder of Voicebot.ai. I'm also the founder of Synthedia, which is the synthetic media newsletter. We do some events. We've got some other things that are going on in that space. And one of the things we realized earlier this year, Eric and I, is that we'd already covered 150 articles in the synthetic media space, and it really needed its own title, its own space, because there was so much going on in there. So we're still covering that in Voicebot, but we also have Synthedia newsletter. And it was just a perfect time for us to say, hey, let's do a year in review, just like we do with Voicebot, with Voice AI technologies. We've got 2 of those this year. Those are both in video as well as in the podcast. And this year, we're also adding a synthetic media addition to this. And I have some experts with me to talk about it. And the first up will be Rupal Patel from Veritone. Rupal, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Bret. It's great to be here.
Excellent. All right. And next up, we have my good friend, Michal Stanislawek, coming to us from Poland. Hey, Michal.
Hey, Bret. Thanks for the invite.
And my colleague, Eric Schwartz from Voicebot. Hey, Eric.
Hey, Bret. Looking forward to this.
All right. And Eric and I have already done one of these in the voice AI space, but today we're talking about synthetic media. And I will tell you that the second half of 2022 seemed like it was nonstop synthetic media. And Rupal, you and I know about this for years. We've been talking about synthetic voices, and there was a lot of news on that front. But boy, was it overwhelmed by large language models and text image generators. And I think we should start with large language models because, oh my, did that take over all of the conversation, not just in the AI community, not just in the voice or conversational AI community. It took over everywhere. It was really accessible. So let's start with that. We have this story about ChatGPT. It is not the only story from this year, but it is the story that's dominated the last few weeks. Michal, I know you've spent a lot of time playing with this, demonstrating, thinking about what happened.
I have. I mean, out of the blue, OpenAI decided to release this thing, which turns out to be a conversational interface for large language model, which was absolutely amazing. And I guess it took a lot of us by surprise. But what is quite significant is that, I would expect normally a lot of people from the conversational AI or the voice industries to be interested in these sort of things and play around with, GPT-2, then GPT-3. But this time, it was completely different. I mean, like my Twitter feed exploded with people trying to play with it and playing with it and getting different results and, doing experiments as well, like, trying to launch a virtual machine inside of ChatGPT. I mean, a lot of really weird things, but also things that showed, how much potential is there in large language models in general.
Rupal, what was your reaction?
Oh my God, it was just so fun, like just incredibly fun. I mean, we saw like playing with it at a dinner party, right? And people just going, the conversation just didn't stop. It was like, oh, can we make it do this? Like, can you make it, will it know how to do particular, like really, really specific surgery. One of our friends is a neurosurgeon, and he's just like, I bet you it doesn't know this. So it's like the tricks and the things, and it just kind of just explodes the imagination. And then in terms of, I feel like it's across generation, like young kids trying to experiment with it, older people trying to experiment with it, experts going, what is this thing? And the jokes around like, well, I hope the card that I get for Christmas isn't written by ChatGPT, or things like that. We also actually at Veritone, our voice team, put together a rap for Ryan Steelberg. And so we just put in a couple of like, kind of prompts around who is, I guess, not even the who is, because it wasn't doing who is at that time. I think the who is now, it's doing now. But it came up with this incredible rap, which we then put to some music, and then we, added a new, like a voice. And it's just fun to see what creativity can get you,
Absolutely. Well, Eric, we've been writing about this large language model space since 2020. And, Michal said it was a surprise. I think it wasn't a surprise that it happened. It was just a surprise that it dropped 2 weeks ago. I think a lot of people were assuming maybe GPT-4 would be this capable, or maybe GPT 4.5 or 5. What did you see out there?
I think it is there's a couple of things. One is that it is impressive in terms of its flexibility, in terms of for ChatGPT, in terms of the kinds of things it can do. I know I've enjoyed experimenting with some more I guess non-standard conversations with it, but what makes it stand out is that, as OpenAI has said, it's not cheap to run all the computation, and they're just essentially giving it away. And so this sort of almost shock and awe approach, I think it seems to be working for them, in that they're now seen as when people talk about large language models, and certainly for the consumer or even business space, their first thought is OpenAI. And so even though there are other large language models and other sources for this kind of thing, ChatGPT has really stolen the thunder for anything like that, at least for the foreseeable future. And despite, obviously being imperfect and having flaws or not completing everything the way it is requested, it still showcases in one sort of neat package how far the technology has come and how much can be done if you are willing to put the computational resources into it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think one of the things that ChatGPT did is exactly what you talked about. It established OpenAI as dominant in market share in this, or market share and mind share in this space. So they already had the dominant market share position because they had an API early. They had their own solutions. Other people were building on top of it. Eric, you've been working on that research report. I've been working on it with you. And we just looked at it and we were like, who can we put in here? Okay, we've got Google LaMDA. Well, it's just pretty limited in terms of what you can do. We've got AI-21. Okay, we can add that in. That's something that we can use today. Most of the other ones, the DeepMind one is not available for use. Galactica was here and gone really quickly, so we certainly couldn't use that. And so it was like, okay, what are we going to do? Different flavors of GPT. And then ChatGPT came out, and we were like, oh, wait a second. GPT 3.5 came down, plus the chat interface was a slight, which basically fine-tuning of GPT 3.5. And we're like, oh, we have to like redo a lot of this research because we have to bring this context in. Yeah. But I think what's really interesting to me is Google obviously has a very capable large language model with LaMDA, but it's just hard to get access to. I've had a good chance to play with it. I did some comparisons to the extent that I could with ChatGPT. And I think that's really, I think it's really put Google in a difficult position potentially. And that now they've got an even higher level of expectation. And now everybody's just assuming that they're going to go to OpenAI. And I think one of the reasons that Google has been maybe reticent around this is that third column over here in the ChatGPT splash screen may occasionally generate incorrect information. Yep. So when you live in the world of search, fidelity, truthfulness, those are really important. When you're in conversation, maybe it's okay just to have fun with it, right? Dinner party, like Rupal said. And
I would also, sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and this is, I don't buy into most of the mystique about startups versus larger companies, but this is, I think, an example where, because OpenAI is a startup, I mean, it has a pretty solid partnership with Microsoft and with other companies, but the fact of the matter is, what they do, if they make even a relatively large error, it's not going to have a knock-on effect on a huge amount of other projects. And it also means that the people in charge of OpenAI don't have to get approval from a large network of other executives. It's really like up to them. And, you know, again, with the caveat of not wanting to buy into the myths too much, there does seem to be some benefit to them of not having that institutional background behind them.
Well, it's really the same thing that we saw in the world of smart speakers. Google was able to come out with a smart speaker because Alexa or Amazon through Alexa had already normalized the idea. Everyone would have yelled surveillance, surveillance if Google were first to market.
Yeah. And Amazon could do it because their CEO was putting all his energy behind it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Rupal, what do you think about this? So we showed may occasionally generate incorrect information, may occasionally produce harmful information, has limited knowledge. What is that doing? Because it doesn't seem to be undermining anybody's interest in experimenting with it.
I just think it's sort of upfront about some of the limitations, because, you know, when you've got these super large models, I think there's going to be errors, right? So when it came out recently with, you know, tell me about this particular person, because initially you couldn't do that. Initially, you also, it wouldn't let you say things that were, I think, racist or biased or whatever, things of that sort. And I think that that's still the case. But I think there are ways to kind of ask it to say something on behalf of someone else, and then you can kind of there are tricks to kind of get around things. But I think part of this is just being a little bit more upfront about these models aren't necessarily going to be perfect. And I think that's actually in some ways generates a little bit more interest and curiosity. Like, can I break it? What can I do with it? You know, when we were, my husband and I were kind of doing, he goes, oh, now it can tell us about people, right? So I did the whole ego surfing thing. And he's like, okay, let's find out, what does it think Rupal Patel is, you know? And so it does everything accurately, except for one thing. It put me at the University of Austin, Texas, because my alma mater was actually University of Toronto, but it, you know, was super highly biased for American universities or whatever. And said, I graduated from University of Austin, Texas. So it's kind of interesting, right? So the errors it makes, you can go, oh, I understand why it made that error. And actually, I think for those of us that are playing with it, some of it is like trying to figure out what does it think? How does it think? You know, why did it make this error versus another error? So I think that's some of the mystique and the interest that it kind of, by putting that out there, people are like, oh, let me play with it a bit more. And I feel like that's what they're trying to do, is encourage creativity through this initial exploration, because that's when people are going to start adopting it.
Go ahead.
To me, I mean, it was great that it came out as an conversational interface, because finally we can start comparing it to the discussions that we have amongst ourselves as well. And this is how I've been comparing it. You know, if when you're talking to a person, you know, not always expect all the expert information from that person. You can talk about the wide variety of different topics and still have a meaningful discussion, a discussion that can influence you or make you think about specific elements, or trigger your curiosity, or trigger an action on your behalf that will further deepen the particular topic, even if that person isn't an expert. And I think this is what's happening here. Is I like one of the points that I've been making is that we do have a lot of linguistic tools at our disposal that can make this particular conversational interface better by, for example, introducing doubt, or introducing statements that would indicate that the model might not be super sure about specific items, and this I think is a great area that can be improved upon, but also make this more like a human conversation, actually. And I think this is the big strength of what we're seeing here, is that it actually does start to resemble a proper conversation.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point about the conversational version of it, or the conversational angle. It certainly made it more accessible. And I noticed that Greg Brockman had said something about that. He's, I think, the chairman of OpenAI, saying people are going nuts, but really what this is it's a UI alignment. It's like, with that said, it's more than that. I mean, he's thinking about that because he's probably been using GPT 3.5. He was using earlier versions of it, and he was like, he wasn't impressed, right? But it's so much better. 3.5 in general, so much better. And then, like Eric and I have been looking at this, 3.5 in ChatGPT is different than in Playground.
And you know, one of the main things is that it actually has a context, right? When you're playing with GPT-3 in the Playground, you don't have context. And here you can say, now write this in a more formal style, and you will get a proper output in the same conversational flow within the same context, which is a huge thing. And also something that, you know, allows all of those experiments where you can convince ChatGPT to become your game master in a game and sort of try to navigate you through some imaginary world. I mean, how much closer does it, you know, get us to like the metaverse as a concept, right?
Absolutely. Well, so Eric, you've done a lot of research in this space. You've been looking at a couple of things, how the different models perform, but also what the use cases look like. You've been writing a lot about people who are doing this. You know, what's your key takeaway around ChatGPT?
Honestly, the key takeaway for me is that the potential use cases are honestly enormous, because essentially what it will do is it can help you create something from a bare minimum of an idea, or it can help you refine or improve or expand upon existing things. I was playing around with it recently, asking it to write scripts for TV shows, and in initial versions, it would write a fairly standard basic version of a TV show. But if I asked it to expand upon, add more dialogue, add a specific kind of scene, it would start adding that in and start expanding upon that. And, you know, it became very collaborative in that sense. It felt much more like I was working with someone who had their own ideas in a way that most of these sort of tools don't. And, you know, referencing the game master thing, it's amazing how responsive it is to human feedback. And I think that is a key element, is that it starts with an enormous database of knowledge, and then as you interact with it, it refines it even more until you can see any sort of creative person, someone who wants to write any kind of text, really can use it to come up with ideas, to take maybe a mess of written text that they have for a story or a business plan or something, and see it all put together in a format that makes a lot more sense. I honestly don't think there is any area of creative or business endeavor that couldn't have some benefit from it. I mean, talking about writing about specific people, even just asking it to write a LinkedIn post in the style of Bret Kinsella, it was able to come up with something that felt pretty real. And that's about as specific. Well, I think we used it to promote the Synthedia, but that's about as specific a use case as I can imagine, and it handled that without any trouble at all. So I think with a little more flexibility in terms of personal use and being able to give it access to, you know, proprietary databases, it does feel very much sky's the limit, with the caveat of, as long as you don't have to pay whatever OpenAI is paying for data.
Yeah, fair enough. Go ahead, Rupal.
Yeah, I was going to say that, you know, I think part of maybe the plan is that they do get more data. They get data on how people are using it, and also, you know, what the use cases are. It's sort of like opening up the platform to understand like where the creatives are going to come in now and decide on or think about these really interesting use cases, and that helps OpenAI build and decide on sort of where they want to invest next, right? And so, yes, the computational aspects probably cost a lot, but there's a lot of return on investment there as well. And I think the other thing too is it's all about the branding, right? Like you said, you know, they're first to market, they're there, and people can't stop talking about like the series of things that OpenAI is doing, from DALL-E to, you know, Point E to ChatGPT. And, you know, so I think that that's the other thing, is becoming a brand name amongst even individuals who are not in this field. You know, it's amongst just everyday people going, oh, what is this thing? And how do we use it? And how does my kid use it? And what'll happen for college essays? And, you know, all of this kind of conversation that's happening right now. It's a little bit mind blowing in terms of what's happening. But I think that's the cadence of the release to me is what is actually just sort of mind boggling, and it's exciting, you know?
Absolutely exciting. And one of the other things that I think should not be lost on people, because they might not have been following it as closely as like Eric and I were, but 2022 was the year when we saw a lot of production ready use cases for businesses be deployed. And one of the most interesting ones, Eric interviewed the founder of Rally Legal, which has this product called Spellbook, which writes contracts for you. For a lawyer, it'll actually, you type in, I need an indemnity clause for the state of California. It'll just write it for you and insert it. And you can ask it to analyze a contract and say, are there any clauses that are missing from this? And it'll suggest, oh, you've missed these 3 things, maybe a non-solicitation clause you would want. It will also say, based on the analysis of a contract, here are 3 points you should consider for negotiation with the other party. So, you know, this brings up this whole idea, which we'll talk about further, I think, is we've seen this idea of assistance, and a lot of us have worked in that assistance space, as something that sits across the table from you. And what we're now talking about is they're sitting beside you. They're the co-pilot. They're the expert counselor for you. And while we're still asking ChatGPT to do things for us, a lot of things that I think are the most interesting are where it's assisting us. It's helping us be faster, make fewer errors, maybe improve quality. And we'll close on this, but I do want to come back to you, Michal, for the final point on this topic. And what I think a lot of people don't know is that OpenAI inside of GPT or ChatGPT calls it the assistant.
Yeah, and I think it's an accurate statement, because, you know, everyone else have been treating ChatGPT as an assistant, and it, you know, I think as part of one of my experiments, I actually asked it about you know, its self-awareness, and, you know, it does think of itself as an assistant, and it is important, because it's also how people are approaching this particular interface. Because, you know, as you said earlier, it's, at the end of the day, this is just a different interface on top of the large language models, but in essence, it provides true assistance. And I think, you know, a lot of the experiments, a lot of the examples that people have been posting everywhere shows that, you know, even though it is in research alpha or whatever they call it at the moment, it already provides value, and it provides like real value to people who are using it.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I'm sure we could talk about this for the full hour. Maybe we'll come back and do that at some point. But we should move on, because if ChatGPT had not dropped a few weeks ago, I think the story in synthetic media for 2022 would have been the text to image generators, which just exploded. And Rupal, you talked about this idea of OpenAI building a brand in ChatGPT. Yes, that expanded it. But what about DALL-E? I mean, DALL-E was the one that really transformed a lot of people's ideas of what these could do. And then we had a little company called Midjourney come along, which is spectacular, and I think the favorite of artists. And then Stable Diffusion came out with a production quality solution, open source, so anyone can build their own. And, I think one of the biggest stories, obviously, of the year was an engineer, a software engineer from Colorado, won the first place prize for art at the Colorado State Fair using Midjourney. And he was very clear about it. He said via Midjourney, and he thought about it as his paintbrush. And it's really interesting. We saw a lot of backlash from people saying, oh, that's not right. You're going to put artists out of business, or it's unethical, or all these other types of things. But then I'm talking to artists that I know, and they're like, yeah, it's just like another tool. We use these. And in fact, then I start talking to artists and like, oh yeah, we've been using these for a while. We've been putting them into our main artwork. So why don't we start with you, Eric, on this one? Tell me what your reaction was, what your thinking was around what was going on with the large language models, the text to image models this year.
Yeah, I mean, I was very impressed with it, partly because although I am a writer, my visual art ability is somewhere below the finger paint level. So being able to see the images that I can imagine in my head, but seeing them, a version of them come to life just from my description was really exciting. And there is something magical in a way, even more than the text, I think, to have a handful of words produce something that can be genuinely quite beautiful, because it's relying on a huge database of art through human history. And I think that it's much like the text, there's the element of, it's just a lot of data being processed in a clever way. But unlike with text, the influences are a lot more obvious, or at least definable in a way than with text. So I think that's where a lot of the controversy you're talking about comes from, because it becomes a question of what art is being used to produce it, who's being compensated, who owns it. There was an attempt to copyright a comic book produced with AI art that briefly went through until the U.S. government decided to reject it and said that you can't copyright AI generated art, at least right now. And I think that there's just so much like the text, there's so much potential within it for various uses. But I do think that unlike with the text, the controversial element is not going to go away, certainly anytime soon, at least until there's some sort of opt-in or opt-out for artists who don't want their work to be informing any AI art generation.
What do you think, Rupal?
Geez, I have an artist as a daughter. I love art, and that one piece, I feel like initially it was sort of like, oh, that's just too bad that it's now doing that, because it sort of felt a little bit like, oh, now like where's the creativity piece of it? And then as you think about it, you think, well, there are other tools that we're using, like you said earlier, Bret. But I think one of the things is it's still about imagination, right? It still takes some imagination to get to that art piece. It wasn't as if it was just like do anything. You have to still give it a prompt. You have to kind of inform it, and then you have to do the same things you do with regular art, where you're editing it and you're modifying it and you're kind of culling it together. So in some ways, we're just seeing different forms of imagination now than we were before. Same thing with like 3D art, right? With this point E, I feel like, part of it is going to be some basic things, like how do you design 3D models for furniture or whatever else, right? But then there's also going to be how do you do something really innovative and different? And it's going to take that extra edge, like rather than wasting materials and things of that sort. So in some ways, I feel like there is this, I want to get to this concept about, are we just creating different kinds of waste? And I think that's interesting to me about like how we can take multiple pictures, now and then throw some pictures away. But are we just saving all these extra pictures and never saving ourselves time? But so that's a different concept. But I do think that we sometimes think that these tools give us all this extra time, but in some ways we spend a lot of time going through these versions and things like that. So I'm not sure it buys us any time. So just an interesting thought around that.
Yeah, well, that's like, I hadn't really thought about this. So what you're suggesting is this idea of digital waste.
Yeah. And the efficiency or inefficiency of creating thousands of images or thousands of viewpoints. How does a human being then assess and judge whether those are better or worse than what could have been done with their own, with other tools, right? So it kind of brings me to this idea of like, we have the capabilities now of making 1,000 versions of the same painting. How do we figure out now? The next thing is figuring out what is the best. Well, what does that mean? To whom? And maybe it isn't about one best. Maybe it's about multiple bests because everybody perceives differently. But it's just going to open up a whole bunch of other thoughts and ideas that we were thinking in a very one-to-one way, and now we can think in a one-to-many way.
Well, it's a fascinating point, and I was just thinking, like, Michal, we've talked about this idea that when you can generate a lot of things, it not only gives you more choice and customization. So that's like the positive side, not the digital waste side. It also introduces sometimes ideas that you would never have considered. And that might be because the serendipity associated with the AI, but also because you have so many more choices. And so that's what I've been thinking about.
Absolutely. And maybe I'm too optimistic about it, but I generally don't see this as digital waste. The comparison that comes to my head when it comes to like generating lots of images is news. It's like today's news is going to be yesterday's news tomorrow, right? And no one's going to remember about it in a week most of the time. And I see generated images in the same category because, you can now, rather than reusing the same stock photo, hundreds of times, you can actually generate something that is more contextually relevant. And it's also a representation of someone's imagination. And this is where I think, Rupal, this is the key, right? The imagination bit is, it now allows anyone who's articulate enough visualize and share what they normally would have just imagined. So I think that's the greatest potential that is there, and if you combine it with the serendipity of discovering new viewpoints or new visions, or again, making you think about elements of that visual image that you wouldn't even have considered if you were describing it, because the AI generated it there for you. And it might be, elements that are uncanny at the moment, but are gonna become those elements that will actually maybe not make sense, when you think about it, but will trigger your thinking and creative process in a direction that it wouldn't have gone to. So I also think that this is why it's great for artists. And I've had mixed, feelings about generally generating images from artists that I know. Some are super excited and see this as yet another tool, and some are seeing this as something that is completely not needed because of their vision of art. But I think that this, like with all the generative AI tools, they're just tools. In the hands of capable people, they're going to create real art.
Well, one of the things that we've noticed is that artists are actually better at using these. And I think part of that is because they have a language, they know a nomenclature, which is related to the tags in the data of the images that the AI models were trained on. So things like lighting and really understanding what that is, understanding what saturation is, understanding different techniques, artistic techniques, understanding different artists and styles. And you just see it time and time again that occasionally you'll get lucky. And I think a lot of times if you're not trained in art and don't have a creative background, shorter prompts actually work better for you. You think more detail works. But if you are trained, the longer prompts probably work a little bit better. So that was one of the reasons. And then the other is that I think this is great for people who are not visually creative or visually oriented, who don't understand, who don't have that vision of what the concept can be. And it's almost like, I want to say a prosthesis, but it's not really that. It's like, it's this superpower all of a sudden they've never been able to visualize before. They can just type in and they're outsourcing the visualization element to this other system, or to it's really wisdom of the crowds in a lot of ways, right? That it's outsourcing it to. And so, whereas we can see that the artists, one of the reasons they're really good at this is they know what they want. They've thought about it.
But then it does, I mean, just to play devil's advocate in a way, and I think it's great. I mean, but I do think it's interesting. Now it's making the language proficient person more capable of doing this. And so again, it sort of creates a little bit more of an educational divide. So if you know how to put it in, if you know how to describe the language, or you have that element, you can get the better sort of images. And so is it really a tool only for the more articulate and educated? So I wonder.
I don't think so. I don't think so, because you can just type in a word and a lot of times it'll do something spectacular. It's like, it's just, you might have to type that word in 10 times, to like get the thing you want.
But what if that vocab, I mean, I'm actually interested what kids do with it, because to me, then that I'd love to see if kids can use it in a way that it actually accelerates their understanding, rather than, because a lot of these tags are coming from adults, right? They're coming from like a top down in terms of tagging the data in the first place. It'd be really interesting to see, does it equalize or does it create more divide in terms of the haves and the have-nots of like, in terms of production of these different artifacts or whatever they are. Anyway, it's not really.
Is it really though, like, is it really removing something from people? Or is it just adding something for others?
I think it's adding. I think it's adding more capability to. It's actually making that the power and the capability for those with more information, with more knowledge, even more proficient. Do you see where I'm going with it?
I think that's absolutely right. But I will say, it's like something like Grammarly, when we were talking about writing, has really helped people who don't have a strong training in grammar. And part of that is it makes the presentation of their written work better. It changes the way people think about them. But through the process, when you figure out how to do commas and tenses and it's correcting you, if it does that dozens or hundreds of times in some people's cases, all of a sudden they form new habits. So I think there's a possibility here. I will say that I don't think that it's taking anything away from people who maybe don't have a strong command of the English language and conceptual ideas for whatever reason, their education, their background, other issues. But I think it's a really interesting point. I mean, you've brought up two great points here, right? That I think aren't talked about a lot. One is this digital waste idea, which I haven't really heard anyone talk about. And I think it is kind of interesting. And it merits a lot more discussion. But this other thing around, are we creating something that's just going to make the people, the haves, like that much more proficient, have that much more, and, create this bigger divide? I actually think it's a leveling because, Eric and I look at this like we're basically professional writers. I'm basically a professional writer. I feel like Eric is a professional writer. And now it makes it easier for people who are not as proficient, not as experienced, compete with Eric.
No one can compete with Eric.
I mean, what Michal was saying before about the stock art is certainly true for me. But it's something I have artist friends who are quite concerned about, less about the technology itself and more about how credit and compensation is being apportioned for training in AI, because it's not something that you might necessarily think about, but considering how the internet already made artists, made life hard for artists from people stealing their stuff, and now of course the the NFT art that is not from the people who actually made the art. It's a real problem that I can understand their concern there, and I know that Shutterstock and some of the other services are building their AI generated art systems with that in mind in terms of compensation and or giving them an opt out opportunity, which I think is a good idea. But at least in the short term, it's going to be a lot of people making money from art that may have been generated using someone else's artwork who does not want their artwork to be a part of that. And again, it's different from text or sound in that regard, just because there's only so many letters combinations, only so many sound combinations that are pleasant to humans, but the range of visual art that's interesting or has some value to people is a lot bigger.
Well, we have that source material problem here, just like we have in ChatGPT, which we were talking about. Like, where did that, not just could we validate that it's true, but where did that idea come from? Where did it originate? What if we wanted to go back to that? And the same thing with these image generators. We don't really know where it's pulling from. In some cases, we can guess because styles are very specific. This might be one of the more important questions that has to be answered over the next year. I would just say that based on the adoption trends, it's not going to slow anything down. That it's the freight train is going.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I mean, maybe there'll be a new contract that they come up with in terms of of like who gets ownership or who owns it. I mean, maybe it's co-owned, right? Because there are so many layers of and no idea by itself also is completely, your own or original, right? Because it's based on what you know and your knowledge and so on and so forth. So the idea that that some particular person in today's world invented something, well, it's based on everybody else's shoulders that we've learned that, right? So maybe it kind of gets away from that idea in the first place.
Yeah, everything's derivative.
And to me, it's like an analogy of a person. You're born, you discover artistic draw, and then you go to museums and you watch other people's art and you get influenced by other people's art, and then you use some of that style within your artwork. And this is to a point what's happening with the AI art. I mean, it's not like it's stealing that art. It's heavily influenced by that art because it's been trained based on that art. But similar to a human that, watched that art, got influenced by that art and created that art. And I believe that this is actually something that will, again, empower artists because it will allow them to live longer because they're gonna effectively establish their own style, So it's gonna be that hundreds and thousands of other images have been created based on that particular artist's style. It will make them even more immortal in the long run. I mean. And yes, I think it's empowering for people, and I don't think it's going to be better for the articulate people, because one of the best images that I generated with Midjourney actually was generated based on a simple phrase of emotional damage. That's it. That's all I used, nothing else, right? And it created a really amazing piece of art that I like most out of even the intricate ones where I used tens of different phrases in the prompts. So I think it's what's going to be more important. And coming back, Rupal, to the point of kids and kids using it, I think it's going to be important, like it is important right now, to teach kids how to use Google search, right? How to use it effectively, how to be able to find stuff on the internet. It's going to be important enough to teach our kids how to talk to AI in the general sense, how to generate images, how to generate text, how to talk to the assistants, and so on. And I think this is going to be one of the most well, maybe not most, but one of the challenges that are going to be in front of the educators as well, in addition to all of the essays generated by ChatGPT and GPT.
Yes, of course. I mean, this is like, we could talk about this also for a couple hours, and I think we probably should do a roundtable just on like some of these topics, because in particular, this is a great crew because we're not just practitioners, but we sort of think about the implications of it. And this idea of digital fluency has been around for a long time. And now, is it AI fluency? Is it generative AI fluency or something like that, which is going to be a critical skill? And how people accumulate that skill remains to be seen. I think it's mostly going to be trial and error for some period of time. I'm not sure educators are anywhere near in a position to help people learn about this. I think a lot of it's experiential. Michal, you and I have talked about this. There's so much that goes on today in our world that learning by doing is the only way to become competent in it. But we could talk about this all day, and we're not going to, because we have to talk about something else. And I would say this is maybe the year of generative AI, but the original generative solution is voice clones. And I just brought this one up here in particular because it was before ChatGPT came along. This was our top performing newsletter issue, was around creating voice clones. But synthetic voices have had kind of a renaissance. And Rupal, you and I have talked about this many times, that frankly, the synthetic voices were always an and. It was like voice assistants and synthetic voices, different types of digital media and synthetic voices. But then all of a sudden this year, I started seeing some use cases where synthetic voices were the story. What are your thoughts?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it almost feels like we've been waiting for this. I mean, we've been talking about this forever. And every year I feel like I say, oh, we're that much closer to it. We're that much closer to it. And this year it sort of got so close, that tipping point where it's like, okay, now there's this confusion between, is it actually that person speaking, or is it their voice clone, or is it their voice clone singing, or whatever it may be, right? And I think that's partly the technology's gotten better, partly it's people's expectations of what a voice does, and how it emotes and how it speaks have changed. And I think people are a little bit more accepting of it in terms of the use cases of how we want to use synthetic voice, and for what purposes. It's not scary anymore. It's more, oh, it needs to have a voice and it can't be the same old voice. I think that changed this year. I don't feel like it was there before. I think people were just thinking, well, it speaks, right? And I think this year is the first year I'm feeling like people are asking for, well, it needs to speak like that person. It can't look like that person, but then speak like every other speaking device. And I think because the virtual avatars and the virtual world started also coming in, that's when we started thinking, well, they all look different. Why do they all speak the same? So to me, I feel like that it's interesting. It took that for our imaginations to think about voice, whereas I feel like voice it's so much more primal, but it took, I guess, seeing it to then say, okay, well, the voices can't be the same as well.
Just like you've been in this so long and so deeply that I love talking to you about this. I actually believe the tipping point happened this year, and because the quality was going up, and expectations and acceptance were coming down. Right. So expectations were coming down, which might be like the inverse of that is like the acceptance of digital. And the reason I see this is because 5 years ago, very few people had ever encountered a digital voice other than maybe a call center, which wasn't trying at all to sound human.
Yeah.
And then we went through this.
Trying, but they weren't doing a good job.
Yeah, it's terrible, isn't it? Well, if you think about it, so then we had this idea that like, okay, that's the robot voice. And then we had maybe a little bit of a broader uncanny valley, like less accepting of things that were good but not perfect. But then all of a sudden, people started getting exposed to all these things: Alexa, Google Assistant, your call centers had all of a sudden were investing in better synthetic voices, media, right? Seeing these types of things. And so the quality went way up, but I just think the comfort level with people also made it more accepting. I don't really believe we got to the point where when you have something more than 40 seconds that most people can't tell. But certainly at 20 seconds, a lot of times they can't. And the other thing is they're not looking for it anymore.
Yeah, I think the expectation's still pretty high, though. I would say for voice, the expectation's still pretty high. And there's still a lot of use cases where people are thinking they can do a whole long form audio with it. And I just don't think long form is really a good fit for synthetic speech. But I do think the pickiness factor, now people are more aware of synthetic voices. And so I do think they're still nitpicking. Sometimes they're so wrong though. It's actually a human recording and they're like, oh my gosh, it sounds robotic, So the word robotic is one I just, it's really, it's itchy for me. It's like polyester. But because people throw it around without really without any idea of what they're talking about. They just want to sprinkle robotic everywhere because I think that it sort of makes them feel better about it, oh, this can't be human generated. I mean, this can't be, synthetically generated. It's robotic. People sound more robotic sometimes than AI voices. So anyway, yeah, I don't know if the acceptance is lower, Bret. I mean,
I think the acceptance is high. Well, or you're saying that the expectations, you don't think they've come down. I absolutely believe they have.
Oh, okay, interesting.
I
want to talk to your people.
I think it's just, it's not going to show up because it's like this unarticulated thing, but I think people are just, because in the past they hadn't been exposed to it a lot. It was more jarring, but things that you're exposed to more and more and more, like if you hear those poly voices, which in 2017 were really good, and you hear them today, you're like, oh my God, that's garbage. But at the same time, people have been trained to listen to those poly voices and some of these other ones. And they're like, oh, okay, well, I've heard this enough. Just this level of familiarity has come up. Certainly the quality is incredibly better. The improvements have been astounding over the last couple of years, but I also just think exposure has been good.
I would also add, related to a couple things. One is that I would say it's not necessarily that expectations have gone down across the board. It's that people, and going back to your point about younger people, they don't look to it as wanting to be tricked or thinking of it as being tricked. It's a style all its own. I mean, you mentioned it not being for long form. I know people who will watch TikToks with a synthetic voice for hours and hours, long stories, in a voice that's it's pretty good, but it's not fooling anyone. And in fact, to the point where the quote unquote mistakes or the stylistic ways that the synthetic voice responds to certain words or symbols has become itself its own kind of language. So it's not that the expectation is lower. It's that the expectation that they have for it is not flawless human imitation. It's a synthetic voice that does what I want it to do in a way that is interesting.
I think the key point here is that synthetic voices have become a part of culture. Yeah. Right. And I think that's the point that you are making, Eric, is they're natural for younger people, for the younger generation. And I think exposure is the key here as well for the rest of us. We've been listening to those voices everywhere. And even if you're slightly older, but you are on social media, you've been exposed to that more and more. And the other aspect has to do a lot with the tech advancement, because one of the things that we were challenged by our customers, Hearme.ai, was the fact that throughout the editorial process, no one has any time to add any or people to spend more time on generating audio for their articles or for their newsletters. And now with the tech advancements, especially over the last year and two, you don't have to spend almost any time on even longer form texts. You can just throw them in and they will produce not only like proper language for the most part, but the intonation is getting better. It's contextually much better. So I think the key here is that, you know, the tech advancements combined with the exposure is putting us in a place where those voices will be surrounding us more and more, because, you know, it just makes sense, you know, from the perspective of news, from the perspective of newsrooms, from the perspective of even, you know, news for radio as well, combined with the ability to create, you know, custom voices, which is also the other hot topic for us at the moment. People seeing the quality of voices that are produced, like the off the shelf voices that you can get anywhere. They're saying, you know, now I want this to be my CEO's voice. Now I want this to be my radio host voice. Now I want this to be my podcast host voice. And I think that 2023 is going to be a lot about, you know, creating custom voices in general.
I love that. I've been waiting for that.
You've been waiting longer than most people. Well, and let's face it. I mean, at Veritone, you've had a lot of good news this year, and particularly in the second half, where you're doing voice clones. And I do want to talk about this, the voice clones. And I think we can talk about this in relation to deepfake, and we can start with the voice clone side. Deepfake technology not being a pejorative term, at least among this crew, it's just like it's just a replication technology. Essentially, you're trying to make something look like something that is your target. But like one of the things you had the announcer for the World Cup. You've had radio hosts who, instead of doing the promo hits, you know, between sessions, they don't have to do that anymore. That someone types it in for them and it's their voice. I mean, this seems like the scaling of this is like essential, because a lot of these people who are personalities who have these recognizable voices, what they have is a scarcity of time.
Absolutely. I mean, it's also like, you know, we're doing the podcast network now is also doing translation of the voices for into other languages. And so that same personality can broaden their audience, you know. And this is, I mean, thinking about some of the work that we were doing pre-Veritone at Vocal ID, it was all about that voice is a brand, is an identity, right? And that identity, you know, carrying on in the different use cases is just really important. Brands and voice identity, I feel like we've been talking about it, and now it's sort of it's here. We did this launch recently with Cameo, Cameo for Kids, right? With the sending cameos to kids and the characters' voices. I think these are, again, ways that we can show that voice plays this really important role of connecting people. And I think that the less we focus on the actual technology and the more we focus on the implications of this technology in terms of connecting people to people, can, you know, bringing more interaction between humans because of the technology. I think that's, to me, that's really where the power of voice comes in.
Absolutely. Well, so Eric, I want to ask you about the other angle of deepfakes here. And to me, the most important thing with deepfakes that has happened in the history of deepfakes is America's Got Talent with Metaphysic, because deepfake was completely a pejorative term. Any Google search, it was all about how the sky is falling, this is going to be terrible, every bad thing that could happen. Interestingly enough, with very few examples of any actually negative consequence. Not that they don't exist, but there's not like a deluge of examples. But it was just a very easy thing for people to say, warning, 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 and get a headline out of. But then all of a sudden, most people weren't thinking about deepfakes at all. It wasn't part of their life. And then they see it presented in this really favorable light. So, you know, tell us about AGT, what happened with Metaphysic, and how that like you've written about it, how you think that transformed the way people think about the technology.
Yeah, America's Got Talent had, it's one of their finalists this year, a synthetic media startup doing deepfakes. Yeah, Metaphysic became famous when they created a deepfake Tom Cruise, but for America's Got Talent, they essentially applied their technology toward creating mini concerts that used their technology to recreate the look and movement of famous singers, as well as the actual judges of America's Got Talent, and then partnered with a synthetic speech company, Respeecher, for their big finale to recreate the voice of Elvis as well. And it's a pretty amazing video. It's worth watching just to see how smooth the transition is, and how again, that bit of that shock element where you can see the judges and the crowd having their minds blown at how competent the technology is, how even though it's clearly been set up ahead of time, it's still being done live in terms of translating the movements and the lip syncing with human performers. And I think that it encapsulates just how common this kind of technology is becoming and will become. I mean, I've used the Cameo Kids thing, and it's great. And my little niece, who I made it for, is wowed that Thomas the Tank Engine actually sent her a message and mentioned her, in detail. And it's to an adult, you may be able to tell that there's some synthetic elements to it, but deepfakes now are just going to be part of life. And I think talking about all the horrors of its potential misuse, the nice thing about dystopian fiction in TV or books or whatever is that it means that when people see something like that happening in real life, they stop it before it reaches that point, usually, certainly if it's very blatant. So you're not going to see, there's a TV show in Britain where the entire story arc was about someone deepfaking a politician in an interview to make it seem like he was saying the opposite of what he meant to say, of what he actually thought, and how it ruined his life. That won't happen because any attempt to do that will be immediately understood by experts as an attempt to trick people and debunked by those experts. So I think it's exciting. I think, talking about synthetic voice earlier as part of the culture, I think deepfakes, both visually and in audio terms, are just going to be a part of how we live. I mean, I wrote recently the creators of South Park have just raised $20 million for a startup they put together for deepfaking faces specifically, but also other visual effects. And if they can, shave millions of dollars and months of work off the visual effects work of movies and TV shows, suddenly there's going to be a lot more appetite for it in markets at the highest level and down to the average consumer.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, now I'll just show this picture again in case it's not clear to people. These are the judges up at the top of the image, who are not on stage. They're actually watching themselves projected. And this was actually the second episode where Metaphysic was there. And you have these three singers below. And in this case, they were not trying to replicate the voice. They were just replicating the faces. And the third element of this, there was actually an Elvis impersonator, and they actually did a real-time voice clone as well. And this brings me to another point, and that, Rupal, Michal, we've been talking about text-to-speech for a long time, but what we saw in entertainment this year was a lot of applications of speech-to-speech technology. And how do you think that changes the way people think about this? We'll start with you, Rupal.
Yeah, I think speech-to-speech for production level stuff for entertainment. I think that it's really hard to beat that, because you've really got to have that high level of production and make that believability. So I think that both have to coexist in many ways. Text-to-speech is that scalable option. Speech-to-speech is the one that you can use for more higher production value, entertainment value kind of applications. And they kind of coexist in many ways. And sometimes, you can have a combination of the two together. It really depends on the use case. But I think this year we've definitely seen a lot with Respeecher and others, really put that mark out there of what's possible. And I think entertainment also adopting it, I think is another big option, another big sort of win for the audio world, I feel like. In the text-to-speech side, I think, though, scalability, I think, is going to be the big win there. How do you get away from that human having to control the other voice and so on and so forth? And they're just, I think, different spaces. So the nice thing is that this year it sort of drew that line in the sand in some ways about what is for speech-to-speech use cases and what is really for text-to-speech use cases?
I think that there's this, the differentiation is along the lines of a use case. Actually, I think that speech to speech is going to be more present in higher value productions or areas where you need to bring someone back to life, for example, for the entertainment purposes, or there's a need for the expression in a way that the text to speech can't handle yet. And I think that text to speech, as Rupal said, is going to be adopted with the mass volume use cases, like wherever you need to quickly produce something that is of a lesser production value. You need to quickly push it out to the general population. Then that's going to be the sweet spot of the text to speech. I think also the difference is going to be for the everyday audience of these things. I think that there's still a lot of education to be done along the lines of, making people less afraid, because I think speech to speech is generally right now being used in all of the examples where you would want to impersonate someone, right? Adding the visual elements to it. There's a video on LinkedIn recently reposted a number of times where you have somebody impersonating Morgan Freeman with his voice and his looks, right? That's scaring people, and I think that there's a lot of education ahead of us to show the good aspects of how this technology can be used. And I think that the awareness in the general population can only be built with education as well, because like with young people being exposed to the synthetic voices in TikTok right now, they just know what to look for. They're not scared about it. They will understand that this is a synthetic voice. They will not believe something that is generated with synthetic voice to the same level as they would believe a real person. And we need the same kind of education for all the other elements as well. We need people to be aware of what it is. And with that awareness, we're going to see more adoption and more understanding for the use of technology as well.
Yeah, fair enough. So I should have allocated two separate discussions for this. So we're going to do quick hits on another topic. So deepfakes, just to close out on that topic, we saw them in movies a lot this year. We saw them the subject of television shows, as Eric mentioned. So, I think we're seeing the normalization of that, which I think is really important, whether it's Star Wars or Andy Warhol. Almost everybody's been exposed to it in some way over the last year if they consume any media. But I did want to close with this concept of virtual humans, because I think they kind of had a year like synthetic speech did a year ago. I think it was like a preparation year for them. And I think part of it is it's closely related to this idea of these AI characters, virtual characters. So we have this idea of, in one case, we have the human-like form, and then in the other, we have the digital brain, which might replicate a robot, might replicate a person. And so I think that's been a really fascinating change this year. And I'll just highlight a couple of things that I thought were really meaningful. So first of all, we had AI Yoon in Korea. The politician who was running for president of South Korea had a virtual human version of himself called AI Yoon. He participated in social media, digital town halls, all these different types of things. Talk about normalizing the technology, and he won. right? You know, if you didn't win, maybe it wouldn't have been as good. But it's a really cool story. We had Jack Nicklaus, the golfer. We had Carmelo Anthony, the basketball player. So we have this idea of celebrities. And then just a couple of weeks ago, Howie Mandel came out, and so Howie Mandel showed up twice here in our conversation today. He is a game show host, a comedian, an actor. He's just very high profile, but he's also high energy. And we'll see how he uses his new virtual human, which, today does not have thinking ability. You have to type in what it's going to be. But for him, it looks like it's going to scale his availability. Also, because his time is so constrained, he can now, through his AI human, participate in things at a lower price points. Because it's not him. It's going to be his AI human. It's going to expand it. And I just have a feeling that if he uses this heavily, it's going to explode the use of this in the celebrity sector. And then that's going to, again, create this acceptance and a familiarity, which is going to bring it into more and more business sectors. I don't know if any of you want to make a comment on that topic.
Well, I'll just say that with celebrities, I feel like it sort of does normalize things. But I want to say we sort of leapfrogged over that in the voice world. So there was a lot of conversation about professional voice talent a couple of years ago in terms of feeling threatened by the technology. And then all of a sudden, as more of the celebrities are taking, kind of interest in it, I think that's sort of making it more, I think more professional voice talent are now accepting it. Like, oh, if the professional, actors are going to be doing this, then why shouldn't I also be monetizing my voice? That kind of a thing. And I think that's going to happen in acting as well, in the visual form as well. So it's almost like it's the balance, right? It's the balance between wanting to being at the front edge of this technology versus being, like, I guess, falling behind if you don't adopt the technology. So there's constantly this balance. I think that's also the balance between the synthetic voices or synthetic characters in terms of how realistic do we want them. So on the one end, we want them to be so realistic that we can use them how we want to. And on the other end, though, we're afraid that if they get too realistic, that they'll fake us, right? And so I think that there's this, I've found this in the voice space that, we talk about that uncanny valley part of it, and your clients will always ask you, make that more realistic, get the robotic stuff out. But then on the other end, if you get it all out, it's just like, oh my God, this is scary. And, are you doing something that's, that's not, that's at the edge of what's ethical. So it's again, that how do we balance those things and also continually educate people so that they're not feeling like it's about being faked out or it's about being deceived. It's you bringing them along for that
ride. I think that we are about to redefine immortality as we understand it right now, because if you are able to clone your own voice, which you are at the moment, right? And if you're able to create a digital version of yourself, which you are at the moment, right? And if on top of all of that, you're able to create a ChatGPT version of yourself with your knowledge, assuming that, you're some person in the future that lives with all of the devices that, help you gather all of the information that happens around you with your virtual glasses and other devices that might, help you amplify on one side your intelligence, but also gather all the information from around you, then at some point, we have all of the ingredients to make somebody immortal, to allow your grandchildren ask you questions and you providing, answers. I mean, we'll talk about the concept of, immortality then.
Michal, I'm never going to invite you back to a podcast because you can't in the last 5 minutes of a discussion say we're redefining mortality or immortality. It's like, oh, we're just going to leave them hanging? Well, I guess we're going to.
It's going to be a cliffhanger. Right at the end.
We'll be back.
Like a very good, serious episode end.
Next up, redefining immortality. AI. I'll tell you what. So this has been great. We've covered a lot of ground. I need to let you all go and get back to your lives because everybody's busy right now. let's just do a quick round the horn here. Start with you, Eric. What's one thing you're looking forward to most next year in synthetic media? So 2023 synthetic media is something you think is going to be really interesting. And how can people keep track of what you're doing out there in the world?
I would say for next year, I think the continuing acceptance in pop culture of synthetic media, both for entertainment purposes, for business, I think you're going to see that extend into people using these kinds of technologies the same way they use photo filters on Instagram, or the way they engage with people just on a casual basis. It's the Snapchat filters that sort of began the visual side of it, and as well as the voice filters. I think at some point the idea of deepfake as a separate category from just standard media interface will go away, or at least be removed to the point of requiring entirely artificial presence.
Okay, and they can find you on the Twitter.
Yes, find me on Twitter at Eric H. Schwartz, and of course on Voicebot.ai.
Perfect. Rupal.
I think we're going to see more language and speech together in conversational systems, and I think that that's going to be really exciting to also just start to see more conversational kinds of speech, because we know that synthetic speech often, we record it while they're reading, and so making it more human-like. And going back to something Michal said before is around, it's okay if it makes errors, that those errors make it natural. And I think that those natural errors and the hesitations that we all have when we're formulating thoughts, I think those are the kinds of things that I hope that we can see more next year. I also hope we see a lot more stuff that's applied to kids. I'd love to see education actually use synthetic media a lot more than it does today, because I think that's the potential there of changing culture, of changing minds, of changing, having more creative explosion. I think that's really where it can happen. So I'm really excited about 2023. And
where can people keep track of you? How can they find out more? What's going on with Rupal Patel in 2023?
Yeah, LinkedIn is my new social media angle, and I'm at Veritone.
Perfect. Michal.
Wow. I mean, I agree so much with everything that Eric and Rupal already said, but the one thing that I am really, really looking forward to in 2023 is GPT-4. I mean, come on, 500 times better than GPT-3. That escapes my imagination at this point. I mean, I can't wait to get my hands on it. And I think, there's going to be further huge explosion of people's awareness about these sort of technologies and people experimenting with it. And that's what I've been saying to everyone. Up until, ChatGPT is closed and no longer free, I mean, take your time and play with it, and, do something with it. This is utterly important. It's a great time to actually play with that technology and, build your own awareness. And I guess you can find me at LinkedIn. LinkedIn is probably the best place. But I'm also at XMStan on all the other social media.
Perfect. All right, folks. I'm also looking forward to large language models next year. I actually believe that the text to video is going to be really interesting. It's going to drive a lot of news cycles, but it's not going to be ready for prime time for probably 18 to 24 months. It's just not going to be that practical to use. It'll be a novelty, kind of like GPT-3 was in 2020. But I think the large language models are already there. They're already providing value. I'm not anticipating GPT-4 to be 500 times better, but I am expecting it to be better. And what I do know is there's a lot of people who are creating new businesses around the large language models. I really think that we're seeing large language models are going to be ascendant, whereas most of this year we were talking about the text to image generators. They're going to sort of take a little bit of a step back, even though they're going to continue to get better, because we're not seeing an explosion of use cases yet. We're seeing an explosion of use cases of the expert assistant that sits alongside you and helps you become more productive, as opposed to across the table from you. And that's really what I'm looking for. So everyone, I'm Bret Kinsella. You can find me on the Twitter at Bret Kinsella. Find me on LinkedIn at Bret Kinsella. Where I'm Bret Kinsella pretty much everywhere because I'm the only one with this name in the world, which is just, I guess, serendipity. Thank you to my parents for doing that. It made it a lot easier for me out there. I'm the host of the Voicebot Podcast, as you know, also the founder of Synthedia. Go check out our Synthedia newsletter if you haven't looked at it. Synthedia.substack.com or just bit.ly/Synthedia. They'll both get you there. And we will have another Synthedia virtual event coming up. Those have been super popular. We ran 2 this fall, just impromptu, like short notice, and really popular. So we're going to do another one sometime in the first quarter, and I look forward to seeing you all there. Rupal, Michal, thank you so much.
Thank you, Bret.
And Eric, thank you to you too, although I think we lost you for technical difficulties. It's because Michal started talking about immortality at the end. Who knows what happened there? All right, everyone. Bye-bye. Have a great 2023.
Happy holidays.